Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I am doing my June wrap up. In June I read a total of 11 books. 5 of them were audiobooks, 6 of them were physical books. I think I also had 2 or 3 books of poetry, so had some variety. Also got some nonfiction in. I also had a book of short stories that I've been working my way through and finally finished, so I had some good variety in my reading this month. But let's get started. The first book that I read in June was Grounded, The Adventures of Rapunzel by Morgan Morrison. This is a middle grade that I have actually seen Kara from Wild Book Garden talk about this series, and she really liked it, so I wanted to give it a try. And so I listened to the audiobook of this, and it is a retelling of Rapunzel, as we're following Rapunzel on a quest in this story. Rapunzel doesn't really realize that she is a captive and that the witch doesn't actually care about her, and so she is on a quest actually trying to help the witch. And of course she makes some friends along the way, learns more about the world outside her tower and more about herself and relationships, and I really enjoyed this one. It was definitely a lot of fun, and Rapunzel's character was one of great optimism and enthusiasm. It was really fun to see the world again through her eyes, someone who doesn't already know how it works, and so we can see all of the things that, you know, seem so normal to us or we may take for granted that may seem more bizarre to somebody else who hasn't just grown up with those concepts ingrained into them. And I really liked the themes of this book as well, that it was a lot about relationships and love, and how concepts of control and freedom factor into different kinds of relationships and loving relationships, and that conflict of loving someone who may be toxic for you. So I gave this one, I think, 3.75 out of 5 stars. It wasn't quite at the 4-star mark for me, but I definitely want to read more from this series. Next I read a book of poetry, which was Old Soul Love by Christopher Poindexter, and this collection of poetry is a lot about love. It has both romantic and familial love. One of the things that I thought was very interesting about this collection is that he has a few poems in here where he's reflecting on his grandparents' marriage and their love, and after one of, I think it was his grandfather passed away, and how his grandmother mourned. So I really thought that was an interesting reflection, and how he really admired their relationship. And I gave this one 3.5 out of 5 stars, although I am starting to wonder if I might stop giving star ratings to poetry books, because it always feels kind of weird to me to give a rating to a book of poetry. Then I read a book from my childhood, which was The Power of Five, which is one of the witch books by Elizabetta Known, and I used to have these books. So what happened is I had been cleaning out my bookcases, I found some of my old books, and I had the first 3 books of this series. And this series follows a group of 5 girls who become friends over time. They find out that they have a destiny to save the world. They each have a elemental power. I was going to reread all 3 of them, and I finished the first one and I was just like, I can't do this. Like, I know that these books are very nostalgic for me. I loved them when I was younger, but at this point I really don't want to read any more of them. I could only make it through the first one. But also rereading it, I could see that like it relies very heavily on a lot of like stereotypes about people, and so overall I gave this book 3 stars. Then I read another book of poetry, which was Red Bird by Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver is a poet that I have found I really enjoy. This one focuses a lot on like nature and being very descriptive of nature, which is kind of a hallmark of Mary Oliver's work, that a lot of it is very focused on the natural world. Although I have read a few of her other books that are more focused on like observations about life and kind of like more about like awareness. So this was an interesting one to read that was more focused on the natural world, and I really enjoyed this one and gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was The Wicked King by Holly Black. I listened to the audiobook of this, and this is the second book in the Folk of the Air, so it's the sequel to The Cruel Prince. Everybody probably knows what this book is because I feel like BookTube has been talking about this nonstop. And this one, I like almost didn't read this book because I really didn't like The Cruel Prince. I thought it was really boring and I just like didn't care about it at all. But I have been reading a lot of Holly Black's books and really enjoying them, and so I decided to give The Wicked King another try and see how it goes. And this one, I definitely liked it better than the first book. I don't necessarily think that it's like amazing, but it was definitely more engaging than The Cruel Prince. I have some of the same complaints character-wise as the first book, that like our main character Jude is just kind of dumb, and the first half of the book I was thinking like, oh well, maybe she is getting better at being a spy, and then the second half of the book I was like, no, she's not. Or maybe she's gotten a little bit better at being a spy, but she's still really bad at like scheming and like making plans, and there's just like so much that she's so bad at and she thinks that she's so good at. She also trusts people that she like so obviously should not trust, like people who have blatantly betrayed her in the past, and she's like, oh, but that's okay, I'll just trust you now. And I'm just like, what are you doing, Jude? Why would you do that? Also, in this book, the romance between Jude and Cardan is kind of a central part of the story, and for some reason, I never really believed the romance between them. Since I was coming from disliking The Cruel Prince, I was going into this book with very low expectations, so really it could only, you know, surprise me. And you know, I did enjoy it. It brought me back into the story. It got me reinvested in the story, and I am going to read the third book, so I guess it did its job. But I gave this book 3.75 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was another audiobook, which was The Sacred Enneagram by Christopher Hewart. This is a book about specifically Enneagram and spirituality, so this is one that does have a definite Christian perspective on the Enneagram, but I went into it like knowing that, which as somebody who is not Christian, like I just like to know going into books if they are written from a very specific perspective like that. So this Enneagram book was very different from a lot of other ones that I have read, in that it focused a lot more on what is the Enneagram and kind of like how does it work, how do you use it, and less on the different types themselves. There were a few sections of the book where they would talk about each of the different types, but it was more of a holistic view about how the Enneagram functions and how it's used. Although I still felt like when he got into the parts about how the Enneagram is used, especially like used in spirituality, there was not as much detail as I would have liked, because a lot of it just kind of came back to contemplative practices, and so it was very like, and then like you meditate on it, which like I'm all one for, you know, meditating, but I kind of wanted more about like how do you work with these concepts or this knowledge about yourself in your contemplative practice. It just didn't have as much detail on that as I wanted. I did kind of wish that it had a little bit more about the individual types, but it was kind of part of his philosophy of the book that it's more important to learn about how the Enneagram itself functions and like how you use it, and less about like identifying your specific type, because a lot of books already address that, and a lot of people he thinks a lot of people kind of stop there, that they just identify their type and then don't work with that information further. So he didn't really want to focus on that in this book. But the parts that he did have about the individual types I thought were really interesting. He talked about some different like patterns of the types, different ways of grouping the different types in basically like what do these types want most, then different ways of how do they achieve what they want most, and other kinds of groupings like that. It was just a really interesting way of seeing connections and patterns between the types. What I also liked about the way he talked about these types was that he focused mostly on the internal experience of each type instead of the like social function that they serve. I think a lot of the Enneagram books do focus a lot on what do these types look like from the outside, or what function do they serve in a social sphere, in a social setting. And while that can be really helpful and really interesting, I think that it was really interesting to have the perspective of what is the internal experience and process of each of these types. And personally, I found that more helpful because I have always had a hard time figuring out which Enneagram type I am. I'm always going back and forth. There are like 4 that I could relate to, but there are really 2 that I kind of go back and forth between. And part of my problem is that I really identify internally more with the experience of one type, but I don't really serve the social functions and do the social actions of that type, whereas another type, socially I act more like it, but I don't really identify with the internal experience. So I still very much identify with both of them, but I kind of decided that I am going to go with the one that I identify with the more internal experience of that type. And listening to this book was really interesting to hear more about that internal experience, and it helped to kind of clarify that for me. So I did think that this one was helpful in that way, and I gave it 3.75 out of 5 stars. Then I read Silver in the Wood by Emily Tesh. This is a new release that just came out in June, and it was on my list of most anticipated releases of the year because it takes place in a forest. It's kind of like a retelling-ish of like Green Man mythology, or it has some of the elements of Green Man mythology mixed into it. It also has a male-male romance in it, although it is not own voices rep for the male-male romance. But it follows 2 characters, Tobias, who is the one that is kind of like a Green Man type character. He is somewhat like immortal being who has been living in this forest for over 400 years, caring for the forest, and is very connected to it. And then there is Henry Silver, who has recently moved into the estate that is like that this forest is like part of the estate. And Henry Silver wants to find out more about Tobias and the wood and maybe some of the magic, which he doesn't really believe in, but he's kind of interested in it. And this one, I thought it was okay. I didn't love this as much as I was expecting to. Of course, I was very excited about it because I was like, oh, like Green Man mythology, it's set in the forest, and like that just sounds so perfect. But it did have definite like forest vibes. I thought that was, you know, pretty good, but the story itself was very rushed. The relationship I thought was very rushed. There is a romance between Henry and Tobias, and that is the central story of this, and I don't think it was done very well. It felt very rushed. It felt like a very shallow relationship. There wasn't really any relationship. The 2 main characters barely interacted at all throughout the book, and they kind of just like jumped forward in this relationship with no build-up, with nothing to make it make any sense. I didn't think that the characters had any real chemistry between them. Any banter that they had was really awkward. There's a part where Henry's mother actually shows up for part of the book, and like she and Tobias have more chemistry, not like romantic chemistry, but like just as characters, like the 2 of them have more chemistry than the main romance in this book. So I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. It was kind of a disappointment. Next, I listened to the audiobook of The Art of Asking by Amanda Palmer, which is a non-fiction book that is about asking what you need for, but it is also a lot about community and art. Amanda Palmer is a musician, and she's actually married to Neil Gaiman, which is pretty cool. But she has a really interesting philosophy on life about really like putting yourself out there and trusting people, believing in people and their goodness, and that that people want to help, that all you have to do is ask, and the importance of asking for what you need. The book is kind of her life story and the whole process of like how she's gotten to where she is, what her philosophy of life is, and how it's been developed over the course of her life, but also how the answer to the question that most people have about like how did she raise so much money on like just crowdfunding was not because she had some great like business model. It was because she had created a community and because she trusted people and because they felt connected to her. And although this book is a lot about asking, of course the title is The Art of Asking, it felt more like the point of this book, or a lot of the themes of it, were more about like art and community and the importance of connection. But I think that all of those things are sort of wrapped up into this concept of asking. It was really interesting to listen to the audiobook of this because it is narrated by Amanda Palmer, so you get to hear her tell her own stories. And I really liked listening to her tell her own stories. I think you get a better feel for her as a person because you get to hear her voice. I also think that sometimes the narrative, I think, got a little bit scattered. Sometimes it kind of meandered. A lot of it seemed like it was going in chronological order of her life, but then sometimes she would tell vignettes of different parts of her life. It just didn't always make sense why she was telling this story at this point in the book. But also listening to the audiobook was really interesting because they included some of her music, because she's a musician. They included some of her music in the audiobook as part of their like transitions between sections or chapters, and that was really interesting to get to hear her music. I don't like her music, but it was still really cool to kind of get a feel for what she's talking about because her music is such an important part of this story. So that was really cool. She is a very like interesting and unusual person. It was just cool to hear about her life and her perspective. One of my favorite parts though of this book, just because I'm nosy, is that throughout the book, like woven in, was about her relationship with Neil Gaiman, about like how they met, how they fell in love, what some of their struggles were at different points in their relationships. But I gave The Art of Asking a 3.75 out of 5 stars, which it seems like this month I gave a lot of books 3.75 stars. Then I listened to the audiobook of Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman, and this was actually an abridged version of this book, which I didn't realize until I had already like listened to most of it. So some of my complaints about this book may just be because it's an abridged version, because I did enjoy this book. I thought it was interesting, but I did think there were a lot of things that seemed like they happened too quickly, or there wasn't enough development in the story or the characters. And at this point, I'm gonna kind of just say that's because it was an abridged version of the book, and that maybe that would have been more developed in the full version. But I've been meaning to read this book actually for a long time, so I was excited to find an audiobook of it, even though I didn't realize it was abridged. But the book is actually quite different from the movie. I think I've only seen the movie like once, so I don't know it that well, but I'm pretty sure in the movie she doesn't have kids, one of the like sisters, but in the book she does have kids, and they're like an important part of the story, and I didn't know that. So that was an interesting like difference between the two. There were quite a few differences. Also, I felt like the book had less magic in it than the movie did, and it just had less magic than I was expecting, or than I really like wanted out of the story. But that's just kind of like a personal preference thing. I just like more magic. But I gave this one 3.5 out of 5 stars. I did kind of feel like rating it in any way seems sort of unfair because it wasn't the full book, but I didn't have access to a full-length audiobook of this, so I don't know, I ended up rating it anyway, but I would say take that rating with a grain of salt. Next, I read Cranky Ladies of History, which is a collection of short stories by various fantasy authors. I think they're mostly fantasy authors. I don't know. These are all like historical fiction. They usually have some kind of magical element to them, but they are retellings of different women throughout history who I guess were cranky ladies. And I originally got this book because there is a story in here by Juliet Marillier, who I love, so I wanted to read her short story. But then I usually want to read like the whole book of short stories, even though I don't really like short stories. So this is what always happens to me, is I want to read one story from a book of short stories and I just end up making myself read the whole book. But this one, like most books of short stories, there were some good ones and some bad ones. There were some that I just like could not get through, so I just kind of skimmed through and then I was like, close enough. And then some that I really enjoyed and I read much more closely. And I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read in June was Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This is the first book in a duology. I feel like everybody probably knows what this book is because BookTube loves this. And yeah, so this follows 2 perspectives. There is Laszlo Strange, who is a librarian, and he has become obsessed with the city of Weep, which is a city that has been lost to time. It was kind of a magical city that disappeared out of people's memories, and he's the only one who seems to really like care about it anymore, and he has dedicated his life to studying Weep, and then he finally gets the chance to go and visit it because Weep has resurfaced, and now they need people to help them with a mysterious problem that they have. So people from Weep have come to collect people of different kinds of expertise to bring back with them to help them with this mystery. Then the other perspective that we're following is Sarai, which I'm not sure if that's how you say her name, but that's how I've been saying it in my head. And I can't tell too much about her without like spoiling things about the book, but she has had to live in hiding her whole life, and we are following these 2 perspectives. Eventually their stories do come together and they converge. And this book I have some very like mixed feelings about. I don't quite know how to rate this. I didn't actually give it a rating on Goodreads yet because I can't decide what I think of it. Overall, I did enjoy the majority of this book. I really liked the world. I liked the writing. I enjoyed the characters. There are lots of parts of this that I thought were really well done. One of the things that I think is interesting about Laini Taylor's writing, the way that she writes a world, because this is the first book by her that I've read, is that she feeds you information, I think, very organically. I don't feel like it never felt like info dumpy to me, and so there's just information that kind of comes up in very organic ways throughout the story. Although because of that, sometimes we don't get as much information as I would want, because in real life, people don't always like just go on this like exposition of like, let me tell you the entire history of this world, or let me tell you like the complete explanation of how this magic works, or something like that. That's not usually how people talk. And so it was really interesting that I felt like we did get a lot of information about this world, and I think she did a really good job of building the world in a very natural and organic way. But then sometimes it would get frustrating because I was like, but I kind of want some more info dump because I just want to know more about the world. It also had some interesting themes in it. One of them was this idea of memory, and is it better to remember or to forget, especially if terrible things have happened to you or you have done terrible things. Do you want to live with those memories, or is it better to forget them? And I thought that was a interesting theme throughout the book. It also had themes about like empathy and mercy, which were really interesting. So there were 2 things that I didn't like as much about this. One was the romance in it. It took more of a more central stage than I really wanted it to. I didn't mind that there was a romance. I just think that it became like larger than it needed to in the story. But the other part that I can't really explain why is that I hated the ending of this so much. And I might actually film a discussion video about this book just so I can rant about the ending, which if I do, if it's already out, I'll link it below. But the ending made me so mad, and I can't decide. I'm still trying to figure out, did I hate the ending because I actually think it is a bad ending, that it is a poorly done ending, or did I hate the ending just because I don't like what happened to the characters, but it's not a poorly done ending. It's not actually a bad ending. I just don't really like what happened. Because there's a difference between those 2 things. And that's most of why I couldn't decide how to rate this, because originally I was gonna give it probably like a 4.5 stars, even though I wasn't a huge fan of the romance. There were still a lot that I loved about this, but the ending just made me so angry, and since I can't decide if it's a good ending or a bad ending, I just didn't give it a rating, and I just don't know what to do. So those are all of the books that I finished in June. I also had a couple of books that I am in the process of reading. One is The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. Also at the end of the month, I just started reading The Queen of Blood by Sarah Beth Durst. And also just at the end of June, I started the audiobook of Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Nouvelle. So those are all the books that I have read in June and all the ones that I'm still in the process of reading. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!